And we must stop those countries that count their wealth and their assets in terms of the minerals that reside in the African soil.
Suddenly, the conversation in world boardrooms is about rare earth minerals. Where do they come from? African continent. And the conversation is not about refining them in Africa. It's not about building new factories. It's about continuing to extract and value add elsewhere. We need to shift these conversations as the African continent. We have Agenda 2063.
The world didn't believe South Africa would ever do it. Washington certainly didn't. For decades, the United States assumed its influence was absolute, that no African nation would dare challenge its economic grip. But at sunrise, everything changed. South Africa made a move so decisive, so unexpected, that it sent shockwaves through every corner of the globe, a total shutdown of U.S. imports. Overnight, no warnings, no negotiations, no retreat. Ports froze. Cargo ships turned around mid-ocean, and American factories went silent in minutes as supply chains collapsed like dominoes. And as Washington scrambled to understand how a single African country could bring its industries to a halt, South Africa stood firm, calm, and unapologetically powerful. This wasn't just a trade dispute, it was a global reckoning. For the first time in modern history, Africa wasn't reacting to the world. Africa was forcing the world to react. And now, the only question echoing through Washington, as crisis rooms, is the one nobody prepared for. What happens when the super...
But in recent times, we've seen how those who were trying to teach us those laws and those values are the very ones who are violating all those values, who are destroying those very values. And we ask ourselves, what are we expected to do now? Because yes, we are developing our economy.
South Africa had been warning Washington for months, but no one in the U.S. took the warnings seriously. Officials brushed it off as political noise, temporary frustration, another routine disagreement that would fade quietly like so many before. But this time was different. This time, South Africa had leverage, real leverage, and it was prepared to use it without hesitation. At midnight, without prior notice, South Africa announced a total suspension of U.S. imports. Not partial, not selective, not symbolic. Total, absolute, immediate. Ships en route were ordered to turn around. Containers already at the ports were locked in place. Trade routes froze as if time itself had stopped. Within hours, American companies from multiple industries were demanding emergency answers. But there was none. South Africa wasn't negotiating, it wasn't pleading, it wasn't stepping back. For the first time in the nation's history, South Africa delivered a blow that Washington could not counter. The announcement spread like wildfire across the world. News outlets replayed the message on loop. In defense of economic sovereignty and in response to repeated unfair policies, South Africa hereby suspends all U.S. imports until further notice. The statement was sharp, unapologetic, and unmistakably final. Analysts across Europe and Asia scrambled to understand what triggered such a drastic move. The deeper truth, however, had been building for years. South Africa had reached a breaking point. It was no longer willing to be the quiet partner, no longer willing to tolerate trade imbalances that drained value from the continent. No longer willing to accept agreements that benefited Washington far more than Pretoria, tensions had been rising quietly behind closed doors, especially after a series of U.S. measures that threatened South Africa's growing tech, energy, and mineral sectors. But while Washington underestimated the consequences, South Africa was preparing a counterstrike that would reshape global trade. It began with Africa's new economic coalition, a trade alliance that reinforced local refining of minerals, ownership of supply chains, and strict control of export conditions. South Africa emerged as a central pillar of this coalition, leading efforts to ensure Africa kept more of its value instead of exporting raw materials for cheap. Only to import finished goods at inflated prices. America pushed back loudly, but Africa didn't blink. Behind the scenes, South Africa had cultivated deep ties with Asia, particularly with countries eager to reduce Western influence. New agreements were signed quietly, new infrastructure was built efficiently, new trade corridors were secured strategically. And by the time Washington realized that South Africa had alternatives, it was already too late. The U.S. depended heavily on South African imports: platinum, chromium, manganese, automotive components, agricultural products, and increasingly, the minerals critical for renewable energy and high-tech manufacturing. Overnight, these imports vanished. American factories that relied on South African materials were thrown into chaos. Prices surged, production stalled, and panic set in. At Washington's ports, confusion spread as customs officers received the shocking instruction from South Africa: no entry permitted. Executives from major American corporations demanded explanations. Diplomats urged calm, but South Africa remained firm. Officials issued a second statement that made global headlines. Africa is not a resource bit. Africa is not a silent partner. Africa is not a subordinate in global trade. We are reshaping the terms, and the world must adapt. Across Africa, the announcement ignited a wave of pride. Countries across the continent praised South Africa's courage, calling it a historic step toward economic independence. On social media, millions celebrated the move as the beginning of a new era, an era where Africa acted from strength, not obligation, but in the U.S., the consequences grew more alarming by the hour. The tech industry felt the shock first. Without South Africa's minerals, production lines for electric vehicles and high-tech batteries stalled. Next came the automotive sector, which relied heavily on South African components. Then agriculture felt the hit as retailers faced shortages of goods they had long taken for granted. Economists began warning that if the shutdown continued for weeks or even days, the damage could be irreversible. Washington hurriedly attempted back-channel communications, but South Africa refused to engage until certain conditions were met. Among them, fair trade terms, respect for Africa's economic sovereignty, and an end to the policies that disadvantaged African industries. They were not demands, but ultimatums. The world watched as the U.S. found itself on the defensive, something rare in global economic affairs. South Africa, meanwhile, stood tall, supported by powerful allies and an entire continent tired of old power dynamics. It was more than a trade dispute, more than a political disagreement, more than an economic clash. It was a declaration of a new global order. And South Africa had just fired the first shot. The morning after South Africa's shock announcement, the world's financial markets entered a state of confusion that bordered on disbelief. American stocks linked to minerals, automotive production, and renewable energy plunged instantly. Analysts tried to reassure investors, but there was no confidence left to restore. Everyone knew the same truth. The United States had taken its relationship with South Africa for granted, and now the bill had arrived suddenly, forcefully, and without mercy. Within hours, Washington activated its crisis mechanism, summoning senior officials from trade, defense, and energy sectors into an emergency summit. But the atmosphere inside the room was nothing like the confident meetings of the past. The officials were not strategizing. They were panicking. For the first time, they were discussing how to respond to a country they assumed would never challenge them. One official tried to downplay the crisis, insisting that South Africa would reverse the ban within days. Another argued that the U.S. should retaliate with sanctions. But when the room quieted and the data was laid out, the truth became undeniable. South Africa had positioned itself so strategically that retaliation could damage the U.S. more than the target itself. The minerals alone critical to nearly every high-tech industry made retaliation a dangerous gamble. Meanwhile, in Pretoria, the atmosphere was completely different: calm, deliberate, focused. South Africa had expected Washington's reaction and had prepared for every scenario. African allies had already pledged support. Shipments were being rerouted to Asia and South America, where nations were eager to secure new supply contracts the moment the U.S. market closed. South African warehouses filled with containers marked for alternative destinations. Shipping companies adapted within hours. African ports communicated with astonishing efficiency, coordinating with new partners who welcomed the chance to weaken America's global dominance. As a result, what many predicted would be economic chaos for South Africa instead turned into a moment of strategic celebration. Across African capitals, leaders applauded South Africa's boldness. The action inspired discussions about renegotiating trade agreements continent-wide. The message was clear: if South Africa could stand up to the US, then Africa as a whole could force the world to treat the continent as an equal, not a subordinate. Even African citizens, watching the dramatic shift unfold on television and social media, felt a renewed sense of pride. It was rare to see an African country take such a decisive stance against a global superpower and win the first stage. But in the United States, the consequences spread like wildfire. By midday, the automotive sector was the hardest hit. South African parts, gearboxes, catalytic converters, specialized metals were essential to American manufacturing, especially for electric vehicle production. Factories went silent as supply chains snapped. Thousands of workers were told to expect delays, with many fearing layoffs if the standoff continued. The renewable energy sector suffered next. South Africa's minerals played a crucial role in battery storage systems and advanced energy technologies. Every delay threatened ongoing projects, from solar installations to nationwide grid upgrades. Companies that prided themselves on efficiency and innovation suddenly found themselves halted by a single foreign decision. It didn't take long for the American public to react. Social media erupted with anger, confusion, and disbelief. Some blamed Washington for provoking South Africa, others accused South Africa of economic aggression, but the most common sentiment was shock that the US had allowed itself to become so dependent on a country it underestimated. In the following hours, Washington attempted to send diplomatic messages through European allies, but the responses were not what the US hoped for. Europe was facing its own crises and wanted no part in the conflict. Several EU countries even expressed quiet respect for South Africa's position, recognizing the decision as a long overdue correction of global imbalances. The US, once surrounded by allies ready to defend its interests, now found itself isolated. South Africa, meanwhile, released a second statement. Africa has been patient for decades. Africa has negotiated in good faith. Africa has followed the rules. But when fairness is denied repeatedly, decisive action becomes necessary. The future of our continent is not negotiable. Respect must be mutual, or cooperation cannot exist. The world understood the message. Africa was no longer operating from weakness, and while the US struggled to respond, South Africa continued strengthening its regional alliances. A series of meetings took place across the continent, all focused on rewriting Africa's role in global trade. Countries discussed new export controls, shared technologies, and united policies. For the first time in generations, Africa was shaping its own economic destiny without waiting for Western approval. Back in the US, the pressure intensified. Media outlets began questioning Washington openly. How did the administration allow relations with South Africa to deteriorate so badly? How had they ignored the warnings? And why was the US so dependent on one African nation for the backbone of its advanced industries? The silence from officials only fueled the backlash. Then, late in the evening, a classified report leaked from within Washington's inner circle. The report admitted what many feared. If South Africa maintained the import ban for even 2 weeks, the US economy could face long-term structural damage. Mineral shortages would cripple technology development, manufacturing halts would cause unemployment spikes, prices would rise nationwide. In other words, South Africa held enormous leverage, far more than Washington anticipated. The leak forced the U.S. leadership to draft a new plan, a rapid diplomatic effort to reopen communication channels with South Africa. But when the message reached Pretoria, the response was sharp and simple. We are open to dialogue when respect is equal and past injustices are addressed. South Africa was no longer negotiating from fear, it was negotiating from power. And for the first time in modern history, the United States had no choice but to listen.